My daughter stood before the town planning board and said that I didn't own a single inch of the future she was building. I was still wearing my dirt-caked work boots. The faded flannel shirt on my back still smelled of rotting wood, machine oil, and sweat from the old ranch. As for Evelyn, the little girl I used to carry through the mud when she was afraid of getting her new shoes dirty, she sat there that day among expensive suit-wearing investors, smiling as if I were just a stain that needed to be wiped off the blueprint. A board member asked very gently, "So, did your father have any input in the redevelopment project of this ranch?" Evelyn looked at me. It wasn't the look of a child looking at her father. It was the look of a winner eyeing the last obstacle in their way. Then she said, so clearly that the entire room could hear, "My father means well, but he does not own a single inch of the future we are building here. I have arranged everything myself." The whole room fell dead silent. I said nothing, not because I wasn't hurting, but because there are betrayals that hurt so much, a person forgets how to breathe. The investment director sitting next to my daughter smirked slightly, then whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Some old people just think their past is worth more than other people's future." Evelyn heard it. She still didn't correct him. And at that very moment, a chilling realization hit me. My daughter didn't just want to take the land. She wanted to erase the man who had sacrificed his entire life to keep that land for her. Welcome to Final Act Revenge. Let me know where you are watching this video from and what time it is there. If you're staying up late to listen to this story, remember to take a sip of water, take care of your health, and stay here with me. Returning to that day, my daughter truly believed that this sullen old man in his muddy clothes had nothing left to give. She had no idea that the frayed envelope lying under the seat of my truck outside was the only reason her million-dollar project hadn't been suspended by the authorities. My name is Arthur Carter. I am 68 years old, and I have just learned a bitter lesson. A man can spend his entire life surveying, securing the foundations for someone else's future, only to eventually be deemed too worthless by his own flesh and blood to even have a voice. I have lived in this Bitterroot Valley, Montana, for almost my entire life, not in the flashy resorts or on mountain slopes plastered with tourist billboards. I live on the barren parts of the land, where the wind blows through the canyons carrying a piercing cold, and the earth demands your sweat before it gives you anything. For over 40 years, I was a land surveyor and the caretaker of our family ranch. It might sound small if you say it fast, but it is not small at all. I handled boundary markers, read old topographical maps, resolved water rights disputes, and calculated surface coordinates on winter mornings, when the cold felt like it wanted to snap every joint in my fingers. I learned very early on that shiny title deeds might buy land, but it is the wooden stakes driven deep into the mud that actually hold the boundaries. A minor error on a map can cost a family their agricultural water source. A skewed line can turn ancestral land into foreclosed property. A misjudgment about the geology can bankrupt a small company over compensation claims. People often think surveying is dry and tedious, right up until their neighbor's excavator rolls into their backyard. At that point, suddenly, a quiet old man with a brass compass and a roll of measuring tape becomes more important than anything else. My wife, Martha, understood that better than anyone. She used to be a history teacher at the local high school. Martha taught grown farmers and migrant workers how to read sales contracts, mortgage receipts, and legal documents without making them feel ashamed. She always believed that no one should be allowed to forget their roots. Martha often said, "A person who clearly knows the boundaries of their land will also know how to protect their family." I carried that saying with me longer than any receipt. When Evelyn was little, she would sit on the wooden steps of the front porch, watching me painstakingly clean my old brass compass. She would ask why I wasted time on rusty objects instead of buying modern digital equipment. I would tell her that every scratch on the glass was a story, every coordinate a promise to those who had fallen on this land. Back then, she always listened. Back then, she thought my work was something grand. But children grow up, and sometimes they grow up to walk away from the very hands that kept the fire burning for them through the long winters. Evelyn was smart, much sharper than me when standing in a room full of slickly dressed people. She spoke fluently, wore sharp suits, and had learned how to make her confidence sound like it was worth millions of dollars. I was very proud of her. God is my witness, I was truly proud. She studied business administration stepped into the real estate development industry, and eventually became a senior partner at Vanguard Holdings, a corporation specializing in acquiring struggling agricultural land banks to turn them into eco-resorts. By 2026, that line of work was raking in more money than ever. Land taxes were soaring. Family farms were exhausted. A single bad harvest could force a lineage to sell century-old land. Clients were anxious. Construction teams pushed deadlines. That was the world Evelyn stepped into, and I knew that world very well, perhaps too well. Because occasionally, she would still call me. Not like a daughter calling to check in on her father. More like a CEO asking a retired old man hypothetical professional questions. Dad, if a creek changes its course after a flood, does the water usage boundary shift with it? Dad, if an old deed uses measurement units from 1,920, is the current margin of error enough to invalidate a subdivision contract? Dad, this is just theoretical, but if a farm is stuck in a zoning dispute, how long does it take to get a clearance permit? I always answered. I never asked for recognition. That was my mistake. I thought that letting Evelyn shine was the responsibility of a father. I thought my stepping back was an act of kindness. I thought that if she stood taller, it wouldn't matter if no one saw the old hands holding the ladder steady. Martha would have warned me. She had a much sharper heart than I did. She once said, "Arthur, helping in silence is good, but disappearing is not." But after Martha passed away, I grew used to disappearing. It was easier than demanding others to see me. Self-respect is a very strange thing. Sometimes you don't lose it in one massive insult. Sometimes you fold it up, smaller and smaller, so your children don't have to feel ashamed carrying you along. Until the day Vanguard Holdings' Eco Valley project was announced right on our own Carter family land, and Evelyn had erected a perfect version of herself. Sharp, successful, entirely self-made. I had let my daughter stand in the spotlight for too long, while I hid myself behind dusty maps. I never imagined there would come a day when she would mistake my silence as proof that I never existed. 3 shiny black SUVs turned into the gravel driveway of the Carter family ranch on a Thursday morning. The sound of expensive tires crunching on the gravel shattered the valley's inherent stillness. From the wooden steps of the front porch, I watched quietly. In my hand was a half-cold cup of black coffee, and in my chest pocket was my old brass compass, something I always carried with me as a hard-to-break habit of a surveyor. Evelyn stepped out of the lead car. She wore a perfectly tailored ash-gray suit, her stiletto heels stepping carefully to avoid the mud puddles that hadn't dried from the previous night's rain. Behind her, 4 men and 1 woman stepped out. They wore wrinkle-free shirts, designer sunglasses, and scanned the property with the appraising eyes of people accustomed to turning landscapes into numbers on a balance sheet. I recognized the man standing next to Evelyn. He was Marcus Vance, the investment director of Vanguard Holdings, the very guy who would smirk at me at the hearing later on. He pointed toward the old pine ridge running along the creek, saying something that made Evelyn nod in enthusiastic agreement. Evelyn didn't lead them into the house. She saw me standing on the porch, furrowed her brow for a fleeting second, before smiling an industrial smile, designed to reassure others rather than show affection. She broke away from the investor group and strode quickly toward me. "Dad," she said, lowering her voice just enough to be heard, holding out a thin leather-bound folder. "Marcus and the board are going to do a site visit of the East Creek area in a bit. Remember to lock up the hounds. They aren't used to free-roaming animals." And initial the bottom corner of the last page of this file for me. It's just some liability waivers, so Vanguard's survey team is allowed to place temporary stakes. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask what I thought about strangers trampling over our family land. She managed me. Just the way one manages an old, diligent, but cumbersome security guard. I looked down at the folder. Under the harsh sunlight, the words "preliminary agreement for site access and status transfer" caught my eye. It wasn't a liability waiver. It was a legal stepping stone for Vanguard Holdings to slowly legitimize their takeover of the land before the project was officially approved. "Where is your survey team planning to place their stakes?" I asked, my voice even, not exposing her lie. "Along the old 1,990 boundary, Dad. Everything has been digitized on the satellite system. You don't need to worry about those numbers." She smiled, patting my shoulder lightly. Just let me handle the complex part. You just need to rest. Rest. A beautiful word to cover up a dismissal. She didn't know that for the past 30 years, those very numbers you don't need to worry about were what kept this ranch from being foreclosed by the bank. Night after night, while Evelyn was sleeping soundly under warm blankets, I had stayed up under the yellow light, recalculating every hectare of arable land, negotiating every water-sharing contract with the county government, and using this exact brass compass to protect the family borders from the encroachment of neighboring industrial corporations. I didn't sign. I closed the folder and set it on the wooden table next to the armchair. I'll read it later. Just go lead your guests around. Evelyn looked momentarily annoyed, but Marcus called her name from a distance. She spun on her heel, walking quickly toward the men in suits, leaving me on the porch with my patience steadily running out. About an hour later, they pitched a small canvas tent in the middle of the dry grass to serve as a makeshift presentation area. A folding table was opened up, and glossy, large-format color maps were laid out flat. I slowly walked over, standing quietly on the outer perimeter. No one paid attention to me. They were too busy intoxicating themselves with the illusion of money about to flow into their pockets. This land has been sleeping for far too long, Evelyn. Marcus stroked his chin, looking down at the eco-resort planning map. You did a great job waking it up. Once we clear the creek area and level the hillside, we'll have a panoramic view of the entire valley. Thank you, Marcus, Evelyn replied, her tone full of smugness. The submission to the town is complete. We will merge all 120 acres into a single parcel under Vanguard's name. I inched closer, my old eyes skimming over the bright red lines crisscrossing the glossy paper. They called it the future, but as a surveyor, I called it a fatal mistake. Evelyn's red zoning lines cut right through the 40 acres of land, stretching along the creek, carelessly drawing up a system of pumping stations and artificial spas. She had relied on the reissued subdivision deed from 1990. Anyone looking at the county's electronic system would think those 40 acres belonged to the Carter family's common ownership, and that Evelyn, as the authorized representative, had the full right to sell it off. But computers don't know history, and those who are only used to looking at satellite screens had missed a detail buried deep under the dust of time. In 1985, to save the ranch from bankruptcy, my father, Evelyn's grandfather, established an irrevocable special trust deed. All water rights and those 40 lifeblood acres were not included in the general deed, but were separated into this trust. And the only person legally named as the owner of that trust, the only person with the authority to sign transfer papers or alter its status, was me. The 1990 deed was just a surface document. The original trust deed was what truly dictated the boundaries. The phone in my pocket buzzed softly. It was Thomas, an old friend who used to be a county court clerk, now retired. Arthur. Thomas's dry voice came through the speaker. I just had coffee with a clerk at the planning office. Your daughter's project file just got pushed to priority. Tomorrow morning, the town will hold a hearing to approve it. She used the 1990 subdivision map, right, Thomas? I asked quietly, my eyes still fixed on the group laughing and chatting outside. Right. They completely ignored the trust fund. They're treating you like a ghost with no legal standing, Arthur. Thomas sighed. Unless you were foolish enough to sign over control of the fund to her. You didn't sign, did you? I'd sooner snap my compass in half with my own hands, I replied. Then, you have to be at the hearing tomorrow. They are planning to rob you blind on paper. I hung up. Anger started to kindle in my chest, but I pushed it down. You don't win a legal battle with loud tantrums. You win with evidence. I watched Evelyn clinking paper cups of champagne with Marcus Vance. She was selling things that didn't belong to her, and she was willing to discard this father to do it. She believed in a flashy illusion and deluded herself into thinking that arrogance was talent. I slipped my hand into my pocket, touching the cool casing of the compass. Under the seat of my old truck parked outside the barn, a dull brown envelope containing the original trust deed sat silently. Tomorrow, at the town hearing room, there would be no shouting. There would only be pieces of paper speaking the truth, and the truth always has a way of making all lies go quiet. The Bitterroot Valley Town Hall was a red brick building constructed at the turn of the last century, forever carrying the faint scent of floor wax and old pine. The long benches creaked whenever someone shifted their weight. It was the place where local farmers, miners, and engineers had once stood up to protect their livelihoods. That Friday morning, the room was packed, but it carried an entirely different atmosphere. The atmosphere of scavengers waiting to carve up the spoils. I sat in the third row from the back. My clothes didn't belong in the front rows. I wore my frayed collar flannel shirt, layered under a faded windbreaker, and my work boots were still caked with the red dust of the ranch. On my lap was a dull brown, worn-edged manila envelope containing a thin stack of documents. Next to the envelope was the old brass compass. Up at the very front, behind the oak railing enclosing the planning board's area, Evelyn was shining. She truly knew how to command a room. The massive projector screen behind her displayed sleek 3D renderings of the Vanguard Eco-Resort project. Lush artificial turf and tempered glass spas sprouted exactly where our family's grazing pastures used to be. Evelyn spoke of space optimization, modernizing heritage, and strategic vision. Empty, slippery buzzwords designed to cover up the fact that they were planning to pour concrete over a breathing land. Marcus Vance sat with his legs crossed in the front row reserved for investors, occasionally nodding in satisfaction. He had victory in his grasp. Anyone looking at the financial charts and tax commitments Evelyn presented would see this project as a money-printing machine for the town. David Hayes, the county's chief engineer, a balding man with reading glasses slipping down his nose, flipped through the thick file on the table. He cleared his throat, interrupting my daughter's fluent presentation. "Miss Carter," Hayes said, tapping his pen against the table. "This zoning plan is indeed very impressive. However, I want to clarify a bit about the history of the land. Your family has farmed here for 3 generations. Did the previous generation, specifically your father, Mr. Arthur, have any input or comments regarding this complete overhaul of the ranch's utility? We need to ensure no internal disputes arise after the permit is issued." That was the moment truth walked into the room, but my daughter chose to lock it out. Evelyn smiled. She didn't laugh out loud, just smiled enough so that all the important figures sitting around the oak table could witness her absolute confidence. She directed her gaze toward me at the back of the room. She looked at my faded shirt, at my dirt-caked boots, and then looked me straight in the eyes. "My father means well," Evelyn spoke up, her voice clear and articulate so the microphone caught every syllable. "But he does not own a single inch of the future we are building here. I have arranged everything myself." The whole room fell into silence. I didn't flinch. Men my age have all taught themselves that silence sometimes holds much more pain than any screams. Marcus Vance smirked slightly, turning to whisper something to the lawyer accompanying him. A few chuckles echoed from the investors' row. They were laughing at a washed-up old man, an obstacle to evolution, a ghost without a legal voice. I looked down at the scratches on the toes of my boots. Scratches from the day I waded into the East Creek to fish out Evelyn's pink bicycle when she was 6. Dust from the nights I stayed up late planting stakes to protect the boundaries so she'd have money for college tuition. I had spent my life making sure my daughter never had to wear muddy boots, only for her to use the cleanliness I bought for her to mock my grime today. "Very straightforward, Miss Carter." Mayor Wilkins nodded, seemingly pleased he wouldn't have to deal with a messy family lawsuit. "If there are no issues regarding consent, let's move on to the technicalities." David Hayes pushed his glasses up. "I've checked the county's digitized data. The East Creek area, where you plan to build the central pumping station, sits neatly within the 1,990 reissued subdivision deed. All the coordinates appear to match the database." "Exactly, Mr. Hayes," Evelyn replied with flawless professionalism. "Vanguard Holdings has reviewed the entire electronic file. The land use rights and surface water exploitation rights are all within the general deed. And as the authorized representative with full power to dispose of the current assets, I have signed the preliminary transfer agreement." She believed the computer screen. She believed what people had typed into the system. The arrogance of those working in air-conditioned rooms is that they always think the real world operates exactly as it is displayed on their screens. "Very well," Mayor Wilkins picked up his wooden gavel. "If the land department has no further questions, the board will proceed to vote on approving the preliminary permit for the Vanguard Eco Valley project." Marcus Vance buttoned his suit jacket, getting ready to stand up and accept congratulatory handshakes. Evelyn let out a long sigh of relief. The neon lights on the ceiling buzzed faintly. I picked up the brown envelope. The creak of the wooden bench rang out as I stood up. It wasn't loud, but in a room holding its breath, waiting for a gavel strike, the sound was enough to draw every eye to the back of the hall. Evelyn frowned. Her eyes shot out a sharp warning glare, silently telling me to sit down and not humiliate her any further. But her control over the narrative had ended. I stepped out of the row. The heavy sound of my boots striking the wooden floor echoed in slow, steady beats. I didn't shout. I didn't carry the fury of a cornered man. I carried the calm of a surveyor preparing to drive the final stake, redefining the boundary of truth. As I reached the middle of the center aisle, all murmuring stopped completely. David Hayes paused before he could turn to the next page of the file. Mayor Wilkins held his gavel suspended in midair. I walked straight toward the planning board's long table and set my brass compass down on the cold glass surface. Then, I opened the flap of the frayed envelope and pulled out a thick, yellowed parchment document that had no electronic barcodes or digital stamps. "Mr. Hayes," I spoke up, calm and clear, "your computer is not wrong, but it is blind." Evelyn was the first to break the silence. She rushed out from behind the presentation podium, her high heels clicking in hasty, sharp beats against the floor. "Dad, what are you doing?" Her voice hissed through her teeth, trying to maintain a polite veneer, but panic had already begun to crack her flawless makeup. "The board is in session. You can't just barge in here throwing around prehistoric papers to cause a disruption. We can talk about this at home." She reached out, intending to pull my elbow back. I didn't dodge, nor did I swat it away. I simply raised my rough hand, a slow, steady gesture of a man who had spent his life signaling heavy equipment trucks to stop. Evelyn froze, her fingers hovering in midair. I turned to look at David Hayes, sliding the yellowed parchment document toward him. "The Carter family special trust deed, established in 1985, I stated, my voice deep and resonant. 5 years before the deed the board is currently looking at on the screen was digitized. Hayes's eyes shifted from the computer monitor down to the document. The atmosphere in the room changed. The Vanguard Holdings investors in the front row were no longer leaning back in their chairs. Marcus Vance leaned forward, whispering something to his lawyer, but the lawyer just shook his head, his eyes glued to the stack of parchment on the table. "What does this deed stipulate, Mr. Carter?" Hayes asked, his voice losing its bureaucratic tone and taking on the caution of an engineer discovering a crack in a foundation. "It stipulates that the 40 acres along the East Creek, along with all groundwater exploitation rights beneath that area, do not belong to the ranch's common assets," I replied. "They were frozen in an independent trust fund to protect the family's core livelihood from bank debts at the time. But my name is on the current subdivision deed," Evelyn interrupted, her voice losing its professional composure. "I have the power of attorney with full authority to dispose of the common assets." The county's computer confirmed it. "You own what is on the surface, Evelyn." I looked at her, feeling a pang of sorrow well up in my chest as I watched my daughter's facade crumbling. "But its roots, the water that feeds it, have never belonged to you." Hayes put his reading glasses back on, carefully turning each page of the deed. The rustling sound of the old paper echoed crisply in the dead silent room. His eyes traced the lines typed by a mechanical typewriter, skimmed past the embossed state seals, and stopped at the final page. The room waited. Marcus Vance took off his sunglasses, tapping his fingers against his thigh. A multi-million-dollar project was hanging by a thread held by an old man in a faded shirt and a stack of old papers. "He is right," Hayes looked up, taking his glasses off. He looked straight at Mayor Wilkins. "The 1,990 digitized data only records surface ownership after the ranch was restructured. But according to Clause 4 of this deed, the right to transfer, level, or alter the status of these 40 vital acres cannot be executed." Hayes cleared his throat, reading aloud the handwritten line at the end. "Without the exclusive wet signature of the sole trustee, Arthur Carter." Layer by layer, the truth fell into place, like survey stakes driven in a perfect, unshakable line. First layer. The deed on the screen was only half the truth. Second layer. Not a single excavator would be permitted to enter the creek. Third layer. The authority figure, David Hayes, had just confirmed it in front of the entire town. "What does that mean for Vanguard's permit application?" Mayor Wilkins asked, his voice tense. "It means," Hayes folded the deed, "Miss Carter does not have the legal standing to sign the preliminary transfer agreement. The contract she submitted to the board this morning is scrap paper. The project cannot be approved without this central piece of land. Evelyn took a step back, her lips going pale. The entire glamorous world she had painstakingly built out of arrogance had just been demolished by a single old signature. Marcus Vance stood up abruptly. The polite veneer of an investment gentleman vanished, giving way to the ruthlessness of a man who had just lost money. He turned to glare at Evelyn. "You said you had cleared all the legal hurdles?" Marcus growled. "You told the fund that this old man was just a washed-up nobody with no voice? You call this arranging everything yourself?" "Marcus, let me explain. I can renegotiate," Evelyn stammered. The hands that had so confidently flipped through the presentation were now trembling as they gripped the edge of the wooden podium. "Renegotiate what, when you are selling something that doesn't belong to you?" Marcus turned his back, coldly signaling his team. "Pack up the documents. We're pulling out." The investors stood up one by one, walking briskly out of the hearing room. There were no handshakes. There were no congratulatory smiles. Only the contempt of business people discovering their partner was an empty-handed fraud. The oak doors slammed shut, leaving Evelyn standing utterly alone in the middle of the room. Mayor Wilkins sighed, setting his gavel down without striking it. "The board is indefinitely suspending the Vanguard Eco Valley project. This hearing is adjourned." The room began to clear out. People murmured and gossiped. The glances thrown at Evelyn were no longer filled with admiration, but with pity mixed with mockery. The power dynamic had shifted, not through a shouting match, not through noisy revenge. The truth, and only the truth, had done its work. I quietly collected the special trust deed, carefully placing it back into the manila envelope. Then, I picked up the brass compass and slipped it into my breast pocket. Evelyn stood a few feet away from me, her shoulders slumped, her perfect facade shattered. She looked at me, her eyes red, filled with resentment and fear. She had lost the project, lost her career, and lost the self-satisfied narrative she had been telling herself. "You just destroyed my entire career," she whispered, her voice choking up. "Just because you wanted to prove you were still important." I looked at my daughter. A profound, thick sadness pressed against my chest. People often think the moment of payback brings gloating satisfaction. They are wrong. When the person suffering the consequences is the child you raised, the victory only leaves a bitter taste. "No, Evelyn," I spoke, my voice quiet but loud enough for her to hear every word. "I didn't destroy your career. I only destroyed the lie you used to build it. You said I was too worthless to have a voice. I just came here to show you that my past silence was a shield, not an inability." I turned my back and walked away, leaving my daughter standing silently in the now empty room. The sound of my boots striking the wooden floor again, steady, patient, carrying with them the boundaries that had never been blurred. I know there are people who would want me to burn everything to the ground. They want a louder ending, a completely ruined daughter, a bankrupt corporation, and men in suits bowing their heads begging for forgiveness from a poor old man. But true justice isn't always an all-consuming fire. Sometimes, justice is just a closing door, shutting forever on those who once took advantage of your silence. Evelyn wasn't fired by Vanguard Holdings immediately, but her career there was effectively over. In the real estate development world, reputation is the only currency that matters. Submitting a multi-million-dollar eco project based on a worthless contract and being exposed right in the middle of a public hearing is a death sentence for a senior partner position. She was demoted, stripped of the central project, and reassigned to handle minor contracts at a different office. She kept her job, but she lost the self-congratulatory story she used to tell everyone. That was the real consequence. Marcus Vance never returned to this town. He learned that not everything tattered and old can be bought with money. One late autumn afternoon, as the cold wind began to whistle through the cracks in the barn siding, a modest sedan pulled up in my yard. Evelyn stepped out. No perfectly tailored ash-gray suit, no clicking, proud stiletto heels. She wore a dark sweater and plain canvas shoes, her shoulders hunched, as if carrying the weight of belated realization. She walked up the porch steps, carrying a thermos of black coffee, the bitter, cheap coffee I used to drink every night I stayed up drawing cadastral maps. We sat on the old wooden chairs on the porch. The brass compass lay quietly on the table between father and daughter. Evelyn looked out at the old pine ridge along the creek, the place that had narrowly escaped being flattened into a concrete pumping station. It was a long time before she finally spoke. "I was ashamed of how old-fashioned you were," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't reply right away. Real confessions need a space quiet enough to settle. Finally, I said, "No, Evelyn, you weren't ashamed of me being old-fashioned. You were ashamed because you were afraid people would know where you came from." Her face crumbled. Not loud, dramatic crying, just the silent tears of a woman who had exhausted all her glamorous facades to cling to. She bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly together on the table. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I called you worthless." It was the first and only apology that sounded complete, not accompanied by an excuse, not blaming work pressure, not mentioning Marcus or the board of directors, just the truth. I nodded, reaching out to lightly touch the scratched glass of the compass. "I accept that apology." Evelyn looked up, a fragile ray of hope flashing in her eyes, but I slowly raised a finger, halting that thought in its tracks. However, accepting an apology doesn't mean the old boundaries are restored. She swallowed hard. "I know. There would be no more concessions, no more powers of attorney signed blindly, no more privileges exploiting the family name for personal gain. Last month, I transferred the entirety of the 40 acres along the creek and its water rights into a community ecological conservation trust overseen by the town. When I pass away, this land will forever belong to the valley. No corporation or individual will be able to subdivide and sell it. Evelyn would receive her rightful inheritance in other areas, but the right to decide the life and death of this ranch had been permanently revoked." She nodded, not arguing. That was how I knew my daughter had truly changed. She had learned to accept the consequences of her actions. Things didn't end perfectly like in the movies. A family doesn't heal after just one hug or a cup of coffee. They heal through re-established boundaries, through awkward lunches, through clear receipts, and through the long, arduous process of not repeating old wounds. My daughter still has a very long road ahead to rebuild her self-worth, and so do I. But I learned one thing I wish I had realized sooner. The sacrifices of a parent should never become invisible just because they happen in silence. And a child's ambition is never noble if it requires them to trample on the very shoulders that lifted them up. I am not rich in the way my daughter once wanted. I don't wear expensive suits, I don't speak flowery words, and I don't command glamorous air-conditioned rooms, but I know how to survey the land. And the truth, much like a precise coordinate, never needs to raise its voice to prove where it stands. Thank you for listening and sharing your time with me today. If you have ever been cast aside by the ones you loved and sacrificed for, stripped of your efforts just because you chose to contribute in silence, tell me where you are watching this video from and what time it is there. I promise you, you are not alone here. If this story touched you even a little, please consider subscribing to the Final Act Revenge channel. Another story is waiting for you on the screen right now. Stay healthy, protect your boundaries, and enjoy the next story.